Hello, class. I wanted to put together a sort of short supplementary lecture on some of the learning objectives that history has shown are a little more difficult than others as you prepare for the Unit 1 exam. This is not intended to be an entire full-blown lecture like what you would get in a face-to-face class where I go over every chapter for an hour and 15 minutes or anything like that. It's not intended to supplant the reading or anything like that. I just wanted to go over a few things, hopefully keep this within a half hour or so. But let's just move along in here into chapter 1. And when I say learning objective 1.1, what I'm talking about is learning objective 1 from chapter 1. But this one involves sort of what we know and what we don't know about how people migrated to America. And I want to point up to this part of the world here between the far northeastern part of Asia and Alaska, present-day Alaska, and point out that this Bering land bridge theory of how people came to North America, which has been around for a really long time, has not been overturned in any way, shape, or form, but it has been expanded upon and elaborated on a lot in recent years. And archaeologists now think, based on the DNA of some of the human remains that they've found throughout North America and South America, that different waves of people from different parts of Asia came at different times. And they're also not entirely sure as to how they got across, whether they came right across the ice shelf, or whether maybe the ice had receded toward the end of the last ice age and there was a little strip of land there that they came along with. A lot of the world's water was locked up in ice at that time, so the ocean levels were a little bit lower, so that bridge would have still been there. Or they could have just skimmed along the coastline by boat. That also would have been possible. But either way, that is how people came into the Western Hemisphere. Now, could the migration have gone in the opposite direction? In theory, yes, but all of the old fossils are in Africa and China and Australia and areas like this. Nothing even remotely as old as what's found there has ever been discovered in the Western Hemisphere. Another question that pops up is whether the ice was also formed a bridge between North America and Europe at that time, which is entirely possible from, say, northeastern Canada over to Nova Scotia, Greenland, Iceland, etc. But the evidence for Europeans migrating across that is pretty negligible. There's just a handful of arrowheads that do seem to have been carved in a similar style to those over in Europe at the time, but there aren't any remains, and there aren't any arrowheads that are lodged in the bones of animals like what we have further out west. That would also be a very politically combustible sort of theory from the Native American perspective, because of the implication that white people actually came to the Western Hemisphere first before Asians. So that subtext is kind of there in these scientific debates, although we want to look first and foremost at what the evidence tells us. And the evidence for this Solutrean hypothesis is not really very strong yet, although we can keep an open mind. This chapter is a little strange because, on the one hand, it goes way back in ancient human history, back as far as 300,000 years in Africa. And you can see that it skips way, way up here to 20,000 years ago or so, max, when people came into the Western Hemisphere. And then the chapter skips to a whole different section, which is who came next, who were the first non-descendants of today's Native Americans that came to the Western Hemisphere. And there are a lot of different theories out there, some of them not necessarily wrong, but we don't have good evidence for. Those are usually called fringe theories. The Lost Tribes of Israel theory, for instance, has no archaeological basis whatsoever. What there is good evidence for is that the Vikings from medieval Scandinavia came and fished off of the northeast coast of America, especially the area up around, say, Newfoundland in Canada. And then they built smokehouses to cure their fish, probably mainly cod, maybe salmon, up along that coast. They didn't have a huge impact. It's not like they built a civilization and tried to take over the place or anything like that. But they were the first Europeans to come to America, really almost 500 years before Columbus. Now, if you look at this little tiny part of the timeline here, that's what's shown over here on the gray timeline that goes from the Vikings all the way up to the present. And that can kind of situate where the United States comes into this with its founding in 1776. So in this unit, the first unit of History 1301, we talk a lot about this colonial era here, and then we get a lot more intensive and do a lot more units between 1776 on up until the Civil War. The Columbian Exchange also is mentioned at the end of that chapter. I think that's fairly straightforward. There are a lot more things going back and forth between the so-called Old and New World than just human beings. There's livestock, animals, plants, diseases, all kinds of organic things also going back and forth that really completely changed both hemispheres. It'd be impossible to imagine the United States today, for instance, without cattle and pigs and horses and things like that. All these things have entire histories behind them. You could write a whole entire history of tobacco and its big impact on bringing slavery to the part of America that's now the United States. The same with potato and the Irish potato famine and the Irish migration to America, etc. So Columbian Exchange is an interesting thing to think about, and things like that happen all over the globe as well. Now, skipping up to chapter 2, the first learning objective, I think, is one of the most difficult, where it talks about how we should maybe revise our typical ways of looking at Western history. This is kind of the typical layout I drew out for you here, with things hitting sort of a peak back in the days of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, the classical period. And then things really kind of went downhill in the Middle Ages for Europe. And that is true, and it's an important thing to understand about history is that it does not progress uniformly or steadily improve or anything like that. There are stops and starts, there are regressions, there are periods where we learn from the past, like the Renaissance or the rebirth here in European history toward the late Middle Ages. They kind of looked back at the ancients and tried to rediscover some of the things that they'd known back then. Like, for instance, there was plumbing in classical Rome. That was not the case in Europe during what was called the Dark Ages, that one historian described as being short, brutish, and nasty. And you really do see an improvement in Europe in terms of science, technology, literacy, studying the human body and anatomy, building better bridges, trying to improve things during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But I think there are a couple things problematic about thinking about history like this. One is that it gives the impression that your average peasant farmer in 1500 all of a sudden lived in this, age of rebirth, and their life was a lot different than, say, a European farmer in the year 1000. That's not the case. Everyday life would not have changed dramatically. But another big issue is that if you zoom back the camera and really sort of pan to the right toward the east, you'll see that the far eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, for instance, the Byzantine Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, or what we now call Istanbul, was really more the heart of the action in the Middle Ages, as was what we now think of as the Middle East. And they had better science in that period than did Europe. And they too also looked at the ancient Greek and Roman mathematicians and geometricians, and they built on that and created modern algebra and trigonometry and things like that. You also had a lot of really impressive technology coming from the Far East that was migrating its way across into Europe in the form of, for instance, the gun or the printing press or the compass or all kinds of navigational equipment and things like that. So if you think of things from a global perspective rather than just a European perspective, there wasn't really this big downturn here in the Middle Ages. That was true of Europe, though. Now, why and how did this Renaissance occur also has to do with the Middle East and Far East, because as Islam expanded up into southern Europe, the southern half of Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain, they built universities there, and they sort of re-injected a lot of this ancient knowledge back into Europe that they had built on. There was a lot of interaction overall between Europe and the Middle East beyond just the Crusades. When the Catholic Crusaders went to the Middle East to try to wipe out Islam, yes, there was a lot of bloodshed involved in that, and it incurred a lot of bad wrath that continues on to this very day. But there was also the exchange of ideas, trade goods, people, etc. And that all helped spark this rebirth in Europe that we call the Renaissance. Another thing that we hit on in this chapter is the concept of mercantilism. There are sections where we talk about how paper and printing helped bring about modern capitalism, and modern capitalism is really what sort of motivated, or was a primary motivating factor in colonizing America, with joint stock companies like the Massachusetts Bay Company, Virginia Company of London, etc., going to make money in America. They were not proponents of what we today would call free trade, which is the idea the less rules, the better, the fewer import taxes or tariffs, the better. I think that is the way trade operates most efficiently and economically, but that's not where they were coming from then. They were behind what the English called mercantilism. And that is the idea that the reason a home country, or say a mother country like England, would colonize overseas in the Americas is to really monopolize and dominate the trade from that colony. Dominate the raw materials coming out of the colony back to the home country to make it wealthy, but also dominate the market in terms of selling finished goods back into that colony. So you could think of like a giant pipeline between England and a colony like Virginia or Massachusetts, and the English Navy, they wanted to dominate all of the trade among merchant ships there, going back and forth in either direction. They didn't want any competition. That's what mercantilism is all about. And that concept is important to understand, partly because later in the course, when we get up to the American Revolution, we'll see that that was one of the things that caused a lot of dispute between the colonists and Britain. With the Spanish motivation for coming to the Western Hemisphere to begin with, they didn't really have one, because they really thought they were going to Asia. They knew that the world was round, but they had the scale off for a variety of factors I mentioned there in the text. But they realized that it was a long trek around Africa this way. Make sure I got my pointer going over here. Here's my pointer going back in this direction. They thought maybe they could get to Asia quicker going west. And when Columbus landed here in the Caribbean, he actually made several trips in the Caribbean. He always thought those were islands off of the coast of Asia, like what we would today think of as Taiwan or Japan or the Philippines. In fact, he never did really get the whole idea of the Pacific Ocean in his head. Later Spanish and Portuguese explorers did. But one of the things I think is most difficult in that section of chapter 3 is what pops up in Learning Objective 3.4 about how all of this New World wealth impacted Europe. Because the Spanish mined a lot of gold and silver, or at least their slaves mined a lot of gold and silver out of this area, brought it back over here to the Iberian Peninsula, and that dumped a lot of precious metals into the European economy. Now, the European economy in the Middle Ages was really dominated by landowners. Money was in real estate. That's who the wealthy people were the people who owned the most land. They were the aristocracy. The ones that owned a really lot of land, they were the ones who usually took over as the monarchs, the kings and queens who ruled the place. But what you get during the Age of Exploration and the Renaissance is a lot of other people making quite a bit of money, like merchants, like bankers, like explorers, these types of people. And when this new money came into Europe, those people demanded political power. And the way that power was granted was they were awarded the vote in certain areas, so much that they could at least share power with the kings and queens through parliaments and things like that. The Age of Exploration and this giant influx of gold and silver into Europe, which caused monetary inflation and created a sort of new class of wealthy people, that had a lot to do with sparking republicanism, in other words, with a small r. In other words, with creating democracy of the sort that then popped up, as you can see over here in colonial America later, in the form of the United States. Later in the chapter, we're talking about France, and this is not animated here in this PowerPoint version, but I want you to click on the animated version in the chapter, and that'll help you. But here we have the Spanish Main down here, Spanish territories in the kind of salmon color. In the green color up here, we have New France, and you can see that they had more on paper. They had more land claimed than did the British over here in gold. But most of the Spanish who went to the New World tended to be bachelors. They tended to be either fur traders, who a lot of whom ended up marrying into Indian families, or missionaries, Jesuit missionaries especially, who were spreading Catholicism up in the area that's now northeastern Canada and the Midwest or Great Lakes region of the United States. But the British, they really came over looking for land because they wanted to build farms and plantations on that land. So they tended to kick Indians off of the land, but they also came with families, which then led to a natural system of reproduction that made their population quite a bit bigger by the time the 18th century rolled around than that of New France, even though they have a bigger splotch on the map. But France and Britain basically fought over North America. There were a whole series of wars that culminating in the French and Indian War, which the British won. And so this whole territory became British in 1763, but then segues directly into the American Revolution. If you think about it, the colonists here probably wouldn't have tried to strike out on their own and declare independence if the French still controlled that area, because that would have been a threat. But also, even though the British won the French and Indian War, they went so far into debt doing it that in order to pay off that debt, they started to try to tax the colonists, which then led later to the American Revolution, which we're going to cover in the second unit. Okay, moving along to chapter 4, we talk about the Protestant Reformation and its impact on America. There are many things to unpack here, which we don't have time for, but one of the questions that arises in Learning Objective 4.2 is what are the advantages that Martin Luther had over some of the earlier protesters against the Catholic Church. Protesters is the root of the word Protestant. There are a couple that stand out here. One is that he had the printing press. And so regardless of how the Catholic Church meted out punishment toward Martin Luther, even if they had executed him like they had earlier protesters, it would have been too late had he already translated the Bible from its Latin into his vernacular, which in his case was German. But the Bible, Protestant reformers started to translate the Bible into all kinds of languages like French and English as well. So the printing press allowed his teachings and his views to go viral, whereas that was not an advantage that the earlier protesters had. But another advantage was that Islam was beginning to expand out of southeastern Europe up into Central Europe around Martin Luther's time in the 16th century. And a lot of the local rulers and princes who controlled this part of the Holy Roman Empire they liked Luther's teachings because Luther checked the power of the Catholic Church, and they too wanted to wrest power and land and money in the form of taxes back toward themselves and away from the Catholic Church. So that desire naturally synced well with Martin Luther's theology, and they became Protestants also. Why couldn't the Catholic Church crack down harder on them? Because they needed them and their military protection that they provide from Muslims who might potentially take over Central Europe, which would be an even worse outcome for the Catholic Church. So those are both things I think that played into making Martin Luther's geopolitical context a little bit different than some of the earlier protesters. Now, this Protestant Reformation also played out in England. They too broke away from the Catholic Church and created their own church with Henry VIII here as the Pope. Is called the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. But all kinds of problems flowed out of that when it came time for Henry VIII's children to succeed him on the throne, whether it be Mary or later Queen Elizabeth, because their religious views varied a lot. And the Anglican Church was seen by really hardcore Protestants as still being basically a vestige of the Catholic Church, Catholic light, just a Catholic Church with the connection snipped between London and Rome, in other words, whereas they wanted something more extreme. So there's a lot of controversy, religious controversy in England, and you can get kind of bogged down in the details of it. But I think the thing that jumps out is that the people who later colonized America and created the United States, they were in large part refugees from Reformation era England, from Elizabethan era England. And a lot of them came to the New World really sort of having learned some bad lessons from this era in English history. One of them is that church and state make for a bad combination. A theocracy where the political system controls the church, regardless of what that religion is going to potentially cause a lot of problems if people disagree on theological matters. And so this is kind of the basis for the American idea of separating church and state, is based on what they wanted to avoid having that had happened in England. Another huge lesson is that hereditary rule causes a lot of problems. Because for one thing, maybe you don't have kids, or you don't have the right kind of kids if you're a monarch. But if you have a bunch of kids, then they fight each other for to succeed you on the crown. And there's an obvious motivation for them to even murder each other, which makes for great plots in Shakespeare movies, or excuse me, Shakespeare plays. But it's not really a very steady and dependable or reliable form of transitioning governments. So the desire to avoid hereditary rule is what leads to then the desire to have voting instead, with the kind of republicanism that popped up in the United States. The Reformation in many ways connects to the United States. For one thing, the Reformation was sort of naturally democratic. Martin Luther always talked about how we're going to get rid of this hierarchy where people from above, in this case the Catholic Church, are telling you what to do. You don't really need that link in religion. You can do it on your own. You can read the Bible on your own. So he always talked about this sort of priesthood of all believers, which is a very egalitarian, very democratic way of looking at Christianity. Who would do the singing in the Protestant churches? The congregation itself does the singing. They have their own hymn books lined up in their pews and things like that. They also questioned, did Protestants, the divine right of earthly religious leaders like the Pope. God had not put Pope on the throne, according to them. The Pope is just another human being. You can see it's a very short step from there to also questioning the divine right of monarchs. And the idea that the justification for why they could rule over you through a dictatorship was that God had blessed their family and put them on the throne. The same person who questions one is going to question the other. So there's a really strong overlap there between Protestantism and Republicanism. Later, when not the Pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower here, but the Puritans who followed them a few years later, when they came to America, they set up congregational churches. And that the root of that word is they congregated on their own. And then from the bottom up, they hired and fired their own ministers. They were not assigned ministers from some big ecclesiastical authority like the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. So that's to a very democratic way of looking at that. Now, the idea of religious freedom, we're going to see in the next unit, I think is a little overrated when it comes to the Pilgrims, but we'll get to that more in Unit 2. Why was there more religious tolerance, though, in colonial America? Undoubtedly because so many different groups were there that each one saw it in its best interests to tolerate the others. Because who knows, maybe the next year they would be the ones who would be outlawed. So I think that the wide variety of religions in America, the wide variety of Christian denominations at least, that sort of pluralism lent itself to religious tolerance and religious freedom as a natural policy. Now, if you look at why people came to Virginia, you see kind of a combination of the mercantilist motivation, which is making money, trying to find a raw source. In their case, they didn't really find gold or silver. They didn't find the kind of spices they had in the Netherlands, or the Dutch had in Asia. But they did find tobacco, at least, which gradually became more popular in Europe. Tobacco is very labor intensive. You need a lot of workers to work the tobacco fields. And they really kind of plugged into two options there initially. Enslaved workers from Africa that they had to purchase with a down payment. And then they also had indentured servants that came from England. They didn't have to purchase them up front, but they had to give them free land to farm on if they lived through the period of their indenture contract, which could be anywhere from 5 to 7 years. That system worked basically in favor of the planters for many years, while most of the indentured servants were dying off before they lived through their contract, before their contract expired. But as more of them began to get land in the mid-17th century, it was usually the less desirable land, which is to say further inland, which is more susceptible to Indian attack. And so they decided eventually, under a guy named Nathaniel Bacon, that they were going to take this matter into their own hands, and they created their own militia, a biracial army really of enslaved Africans and white indentured servants, and at first started to fight Indians, but then with the momentum that they built up, they really decided to turn back on their true enemy, which was the wealthier white people. Further back toward the coast, they tried to overthrow the Virginia gentry, or the squirearchy, or the planters who ran Virginia. They failed to do that, but the wealthy whites learned an important lesson there, which is if blacks and whites gang up on them, that endangers them more, and so they wanted to drive a wedge between the enslaved African population and the poor whites, barring further intermarriage, or saying that any product of that union that child would naturally be a slave. But what they did overall is they basically began to phase out white indentured servitude and transition toward black slavery. They racialized slavery, in effect, and in so doing, they closed ranks racially and co-opted the poor white people into their system. How did they do that? They gave them better land, which in turn, this is very important, gave them the vote. So they granted poor whites the vote in areas of the South where there was a large black population. That didn't happen in other parts of Europe where there was no black population. So you skip forward 100 years from here up to the American Revolution, and you have people back in Britain noting the hypocrisy of America's founding fathers, saying, wow, have you noticed that the people yelling the loudest for liberty and talking about liberty and all this stuff happen to be slave owners? What a bunch of hypocrites. It's true, they were hypocrites, but I think it goes deeper than that. I think that you could argue that in the southern colonies, at least, that slavery caused democracy, that slavery was the motivating factor as to why the wealthy whites granted poor whites the vote, to protect themselves and close ranks racially and bring the poor whites into the fold. Now, a different form of democracy emerged in New England, where slavery was legal, but they didn't have a lot of slavery because they didn't have a lot of plantations or anything like that. And if you wanted to skip forward 200 years from Bacon's Rebellion to the American Civil War, you can kind of see these competing forms of democracy colliding there. But if this connection of slavery and democracy seems weird to you, I urge you to look back at ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Those are really the societies that invented republicanism and voting and things like that. They too were built on a foundation of slavery. It wasn't racialized slavery, but it still was slavery. And so, yes, everyone could vote. No, only all of the free people could vote, who were a fairly small percentage of the people, whereas most of the people were enslaved workers. So it's not that odd to see that that very thing happened in the southern colonies. And in fact, if you speed forward a couple hundred years to the Civil War, you have people like John Calhoun in South Carolina saying that you can't get rid of slavery because if you get rid of slavery, democracy will collapse. So, food for thought for a later unit. Hopefully, going over these LOs will help you prepare for the Unit 1 exam, and good luck on that exam.